The Law of Death. The first spell in this lorebook, Aspect of the Dread Knight, is one you'll either bring for the imbuement of magical attacks or for the fear and terror, which makes this a kind of dual-purpose spell. Occasionally, you'll want to use them both at the same time, but for the most part, you'll be using one or the other, I'd say. It's a very cheap 4 winds of magic as well. The Overcast version adds an area of effect which is handy and extends the duration. It also gives 8 leadership, which is a nice bonus to the spell, but not really a reason that you would use the spell. Now there's 2 prime victims of this spell. One is going to be ethereal units or any unit with a physical resistance. Ethereal units like Hex Wraiths especially, because they have a massive 55% physical resistance, which will be taken away when you imbue magical attacks to your friendly troops, meaning they'll take damage pretty damn quickly. The other target for this spell is going to be any kind of low leadership unit, and that can be literally any unit. Even if it's a top tier unit, its leadership will go down eventually, and you may be able to terror route it, provided they don't have an immunity to psychology, of course. So when you see one of your units about to engage an ethereal unit, like these gobbos here, you pop Aspect of the Dread Knight on them, and now they've got the upper hand, whereas Cairn Wraiths would have had the upper hand otherwise. So it's a great way to turn the tables on these ethereal units. Same idea with things like demons, witch elves, blade singers. They've all got physical resistances that will be affected by this. Not quite as much, but still a good amount. And it's an especially essential spell for factions that don't have a lot or no magical attacks, like the Greenskins for example. They have no units with magical attacks, so the only way for them to do magic damage is with actual spells, which isn't ideal, so Aspect of the Dread Knight is somewhat essential. The other way to use this spell is to make use of that fear and terror, looking for low leadership units, dropping Aspect of the Dread Knight to give your unit terror, and provided the enemy's leadership is 13 or below, they will be terror routed. So you can break a unit quicker than you normally would. The Overcast version can be especially handy for groups of enemies, especially low leadership stuff like these stinking rats. When the spell goes off, it'll apply the -8 leadership from the fear, and if that brings them down to 13 or below, off they go. As you can see, it can be a good way to get some mass routes in the right situations. So Aspect of the Dread Knight, great for turning the tables on physical resistance units, or for breaking any low leadership quicker than normal. And then to a classic in Spirit Leech, one of the most used spells in this lorebook, and for good reason. It's very simple, very effective, isn't massively expensive, and is useful against any faction. The Overcast version only extends the range at which you can use it, but it only costs 3 winds of magic, so it can be handy to use that if necessary. The spell is designed to be targeted exclusively at single entities, so namely lords and heroes, but also single entity monsters and such as well. Naturally though, targeting the Lord is usually going to be the best choice with this spell, as they are the most valuable unit on the field. There really isn't too much to say tactically about this spell because it's incredibly simple to use. Just keep spamming it on any single entities. Whatever you think is the most dangerous, this can whittle them down pretty well. You can be reasonably justified in just using Spirit Leech for an entire battle. As soon as it comes off cooldown, you use it again because the cooldown's only like 30 seconds, so you can use up your winds of magic that way. That's perfectly justified. There's a chance the enemy may resist some of the damage, but there's nothing you can do about that, so it's not really worth thinking about. But this is a great spell if you struggle with micromanaging or you struggle with remembering to use magic. This can be a great spell. It's one spell to think about. Just keep spamming off Spirit Leech as often as you can, and you can do good work with your magic that way. You don't need to worry about looking out for the right target at the right moment or timing. You can just keep spamming it off on those single entities. Nice and simple. Next to Doom and Darkness, -16 leadership, costs 7 winds of magic, lasts 36 seconds, which is a pretty damn long time, and the Overcast version will add an area of effect, which can be very, very nice. With this spell, we're looking to do exactly the same thing as with Aspect of the Dread Knight, breaking a unit's leadership sooner than normal, which naturally again makes our target the low leadership units, whether it's Peasant Mob or some mid-tier unit like Plague Monks, or some high-tier unit like Swordmasters of Hoeth. If they're on low leadership, they can be broken. So again, we're just scouring the battlefield for any low leadership that we can push over the edge, or maybe a group that we can push over the edge with the area of effect upgraded version. That makes this spell incredibly powerful towards the end of a battle, when all the units are beaten up and everyone's running around on low leadership. This can be a great way to route a unit sooner than normal, and it can also be comboed up with Aspect of the Dread Knight, because that'll add fear, which will take away another 8 leadership, potentially, provided the unit doesn't cause fear themselves or has immunity to psychology, which means you can combo these two spells up to do a nice -24 leadership to a unit, And remember that you can terror route a unit if it's got 13 leadership or below. So if you combo these two spells to give you minus 24 leadership and get them down to 13 leadership, that means you can potentially route a unit when it's got roughly 37 leadership. Very nice. But this spell can still work pretty well against things that don't route, like vampire units, or undead units rather. A Terrorgeist here, it'll get him crumbling and losing health quicker than he normally would, so it can still be useful in this situation. So, Doom and Darkness, great for routing things sooner or making things die sooner, and a very dangerous spell in the late game. Next to Soul Blight, an AoE area spell that takes away 30 armor of all enemies in that AoE. It also reduces their damage, but I would just say that's a nice secondary bonus, not really the primary reason you would use this spell. It's relatively cheap in magic cost, but only lasts 18 seconds, although the Overcast version can extend that to a much nicer 36 seconds, albeit for more magic cost, of course. The prime target for this spell, I would say, is groups of lesser armored units. Anything with about 80 armor or less. I say that because I think it's much more useful to take a 30 armored unit down to 0 armor than taking a, say, 130 armored unit down to 100 armor, because 100 armor is still a fucking lot of armor, so it doesn't really feel as effective as it's not going to allow much more damage through. So look for situations like this where there's a bunch of enemies all in one place and you can just debuff and take away their armor. We've got Kata in here down to 15 armor, which means she's going to take a lot more damage from Skin Wolves. We've got the Bears here knocked down from 100 armor to 70, which isn't a huge improvement, but it's something, right? And this spell can be useful at any point in the battle, at the start, at the end, doesn't really matter. Taking away armor is always going to be a pretty powerful thing. It's maybe somewhat wasteful to use this spell on one unit, like I'm doing here on these Saga with great weapons. They're a powerful unit that needs to be taken out, but it's only put them down to 60 armor, which isn't terrible, which probably isn't making the spell very effective anyway, especially as it's used on one target when it could be hitting 3, 4, or 5 different targets. So this spell can be useful in many situations against many factions. Maybe against someone like the Dwarves, it's still going to be useful even though they have high armor. Unless you've got a lot of armor piercing, maybe you don't need that reduction to armor, although it can help. So it's never going to be a spell that really hurts you, but one that you can certainly waste if you only use it on one target maybe. Although perhaps there's a situation where it could be good to use it on a single target. Perhaps if you've got a Lord trapped and you've got all the tools there to do a lot of damage to them quickly, you can take their armor down to do even more damage even more quickly. That could be a good use of 8 magic. So Soul Blight is a great way to do some extra damage to a group of enemy units while also making them slightly less dangerous, taking away their DPS. A very nice debuffing spell. On to our second to last spell, the Purple Son of Sirius. I don't know, another word people can tell me I'm mispronouncing. This is a very, very powerful spell, but is one I generally recommend to avoid unless very specific situations arise. Those situations being the prime targets, which could be a tightly packed enemy formation that you can drop this spell in the middle of. Or a tightly packed clump of enemies. Typically in choke points, the AI likes to run all their units into the back of each other, and you'll end up with a big mass of troops that look something like this. That can be a good place for a Purple Sun. Outside of those two situations, you'll probably have it go something like this. You'll drop the Purple Sun on a powerful enemy unit, it'll do damage for like half a second, and then it'll just bugger off in its own direction and do basically nothing. Very little damage done, certainly not 18 winds of magic worth of damage done, and it's kind of a waste. Plus, there's the risk if you do this in the middle of a battle when all your units are around as well, there's the risk it'll go into your own units and commit some friendly fire, thus making the spell even more useless. For me personally, I really don't like these RNG spells that rely on luck to go in the right direction to serve you. But if you like a gamble, then by all means you can use these spells. They are very powerful and they will do a lot of damage as long as there's targets always under them. But that's the difficult thing, getting targets to stay under them. Which is why I say the prime 2 situations is tightly packed formations or just clumps of enemy troops, because you're more guaranteed to actually hit stuff. If you can get that to happen, it can do absolutely ungodly amounts of damage. But for me, that doesn't happen often enough to warrant using this spell and potentially wasting 18 winds of magic. I'd much rather use a less powerful spell that is guaranteed to go where I put it, when I put it, and will guaranteed do the damage that I guaranteed it goddamn do. Guaranteed. Which is very much like our last spell, the Fate of Yoona. This spell is guaranteed to do its damage. No ifs, ands, or buts, no RNG. And this spell is very powerful, but very expensive at 22 winds of magic, but at least you know that 22 winds of magic isn't going to waste, provided you use it on the right target, which is infantry or cavalry primarily, something with a higher model count, anything with 25 men or above, maybe some monstrous infantry perhaps. But this is another great spell, much like Spirit Leech. It doesn't require any thinking, just look for a strong target of infantry or cavalry and drop this spell. No timing required, it's very simple. You can keep spamming it off, although it's very expensive, so you're not going to spam it very often. Or if you've got a lot of magic in your pool and you want to get rid of some of it so it doesn't go to waste, this can be a great spell just to drop off and use up the magic for some guaranteed return. Given the expensive nature of the spell as well, you're going to be best off using it against the most expensive, toughest elite enemy units, like Council Guard here, like the War Bears for Kislev just now. Anything that's top tier, it's kind of a waste if you use it on Peasant Mob, for example. You'll absolutely destroy them, by all means, but it's a big waste of 22 magic to get rid of a unit that costs 100 gold, for example. So that is the fate of Yoona. And that overall is the Law of Death. You can find me on Patreon if you wish to support this channel, like these lovely people here. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.